The champagne flute in Walter's hand felt like a prop in a play he hadn't auditioned for. Around him, the room buzzed with the kind of laughter that sounded like knives being sharpened. Polite, practiced, and pointed. He adjusted the collar of his navy suit, the one he'd worn to their wedding 23 years ago. It still fit perfectly, though now it felt like armor too thin for the battlefield. Deborah stood a few feet away, her back to him, her slender frame draped in a dress that shimmered like liquid gold. She was holding court as usual, a glass of wine in one hand and the room's attention in the other. Walter caught snippets of her conversation. Something about innovation and staying relevant. He should have known better than to think she was talking about music. Then she turned to him, her eyes glinting with something sharper than amusement. "And speaking of relics," she said, her voice slicing through the chatter. "Look at my husband here, still rocking the analog age. Aren't you, Walter?" Her smirk was a dagger, twisting slowly. "I swear, if I didn't know better, I'd think he time-traveled from the 80s just to embarrass me." The room erupted in muffled laughter, the kind that people stifle behind their hands because they know they shouldn't be laughing but can't help themselves. Walter's face burned. He looked down at his suit, suddenly aware of how out of place he was among the tailored jackets and designer dresses. The fabric felt heavy, like it was made of lead instead of wool. "Deborah," he started, his voice low, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Oh, don't be so serious, Walter," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "It's just a joke. Lighten up." She turned back to her audience, her smile widening. "You know how engineers are, always so literal." The crowd laughed again, louder this time, and Walter felt something inside him crack. It wasn't just the humiliation. It was the way she wielded it, like she'd been waiting for the perfect moment to remind him of his place. Or maybe to remind herself. He excused himself quietly, slipping out of the room like a shadow. The hallway was cool and dark, a welcome reprieve from the glaring lights and sharper tongues. He leaned against the wall, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of the woman she'd become, or maybe the woman she'd always been. As he stood there, staring at the peeling wallpaper, he couldn't help but wonder how many other nights like this he'd endured. How many times he'd laughed along with her jokes, pretending they didn't cut as deep as they did. How many times he'd told himself it was just her way, that she didn't mean it. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the cracks felt too wide to ignore. And as the muffled laughter from the party echoed down the hall, Walter realized something he'd been too afraid to admit. He wasn't sure he could keep pretending. The nights had started to feel longer, the shadows in their bedroom stretching like fingers across the walls. Walter lay there, staring at the ceiling, the faint blue glow of Deborah's phone screen flickering in the dark. She was always on it now, typing away with this strange urgency, her face illuminated in that cold, clinical light. He'd ask her, "Who are you texting at this hour?" And she'd snap the phone shut like she'd been caught stealing. "Work," she'd say, her voice sharp, rehearsed, like she'd practiced the answer in her head 100 times. You wouldn't understand. But Walter understood plenty. He understood the way her absences had grown from occasional late nights at the studio to entire weekends away. He understood the way she'd come home smelling like coffee and something else. Something musky and foreign, a cologne that wasn't his. He understood the way she'd roll her eyes when he brought it up, like he was some paranoid old man clinging to the past. "You're imagining things," she'd say, her tone dripping with that same icy condescension she'd used at the party. But Walter wasn't imagining the empty side of the bed, the cold sheets where she should have been. He'd started to notice other things too. The way she'd suddenly taken an interest in this kid she was producing, some up-and-coming musician half her age. She'd talk about him like he was the second coming of Hendrix, her voice softening in a way it hadn't done for Walter in years. "He's got such raw talent," she'd gush, her eyes lighting up in a way that made Walter's stomach twist. "He just needs the right guidance." And then she'd be off again, disappearing into the night, leaving Walter alone with his thoughts and the faint echo of her laughter. One night he'd confronted her. "What's really going on, Deborah?" he'd asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. She'd looked at him like he was a stranger, her lips curling into that same degrading smirk she'd used at the party. "You're being ridiculous," she'd said, her tone cutting through him like a blade. I'm working, that's all. If you can't handle that, maybe you should find a hobby. But Walter didn't need a hobby. He needed answers. And as the days turned into weeks, the pieces started to fall into place. The late-night calls, the unfamiliar scent, the way she'd flinch when he touched her, like his hands were made of fire. It was all there, right in front of him, but he couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. Not yet, because saying it would make it real, and he wasn't ready for that. Not now, maybe not ever. So he lay there, night after night, staring at the empty side of the bed, the faint glow of her phone screen burning into his memory. And as the hours dragged on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something he couldn't stop, no matter how hard he tried. The bag was sitting on the kitchen island like a taunt. Deborah's designer handbag, some Italian name Walter couldn't pronounce, bought with their money, of course. She'd left it there after storming out earlier that morning, her heels clicking sharply against the tile as she muttered something about a recording session. He hadn't even asked where she was going anymore. What was the point? She'd just lie, or worse, look at him with that cold, detached smirk, like he was some sad relic she'd outgrown. But today, something about the bag felt different. It wasn't the usual sleek, closed-up fortress she carried. The zipper was slightly open, the leather flap folded back just enough to reveal the edge of something white peeking out. A receipt, maybe, or a napkin. Walter told himself he didn't care. He wasn't the type to snoop. He'd spent decades building things, circuits, systems, a life with Deborah, not tearing them apart. But his hands were moving before his brain could stop them, pulling the zipper wider, fingers brushing against the soft leather interior. And then he saw it. A crumpled piece of paper, folded haphazardly, the edges frayed as if it had been handled 100 times. His breath hitched as he pulled it out, the paper trembling in his grip. The smell hit him first, something faintly sweet, like the cologne she'd started wearing a few months ago. Not his, never his. The note was short, scrawled in messy, loopy handwriting that screamed youth and arrogance. Deborah, last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you. Forever yours. A heart was drawn at the bottom, clumsy and overdone, like something a teenager would doodle in a yearbook. Walter stared at it, his vision blurring as the words burned into his brain. His chest tightened, a sharp, stabbing pain that made him clutch the edge of the counter. His hands were shaking so badly now that the note fluttered like a dying bird, threatening to slip from his grasp. He wanted to rip it to shreds, to burn it, to scream until his throat tore open. But instead, he just stood there, frozen, staring at that stupid heart. It wasn't the words that killed him, it was the physicality of it. The way the ink smudged in one corner, like the guy had been in a hurry. The faint creases where it had been folded and unfolded, over and over. The way it smelled like him. This wasn't just some fleeting mistake. This was deliberate, calculated, real. Walter's legs gave out, and he sank onto the stool, the note still clutched in his hand. His mind raced, replaying every late-night phone call, every unexplained absence, every time she'd flinched when he touched her. The signs had been there all along, hadn't they? He just hadn't wanted to see them. Or maybe he had, and he'd been too afraid to admit it. Too afraid to face the truth. That the woman he'd loved for over 20 years had been slipping away, inch by inch, while he stood there helpless. The bag glared at him from the counter, its sleek leather mocking his naivety. He wanted to hurl it across the room, to watch it smash against the wall and scatter its contents like evidence at a crime scene. But he didn't. He just sat there, staring at the note, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a grenade, and it had just blown his marriage to pieces. The house was eerily quiet when Walter finally cornered her. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the air before a storm. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom, the crumpled love note still clutched in his hand, the edges digging into his palm. Deborah was at her vanity, carefully applying lipstick, her reflection calm and unbothered. The faint scent of her perfume, something expensive and floral, hung in the air, but it felt wrong now, like a mask over something rotten. "We need to talk," Walter said, his voice low but steady. He'd rehearsed this moment in his head a dozen times, but now that it was here, the words felt clumsy, like they didn't belong to him. Deborah didn't look up. About what? She asked, her tone flat, as if she already knew but couldn't be bothered to care. Walter stepped closer, holding out the note. This. What is this? His hand trembled slightly, and he hated himself for it. He wanted to be firm, unshakable, but his body betrayed him. She glanced at the note, her expression flickering for just a second. Something like annoyance, maybe even pity, before it hardened again. Oh, that, she said, finally turning to face him. She crossed her arms, her designer robe pulling taut against her shoulders. I thought you'd figure it out eventually. Figure what out? Walter's voice rose, sharp and jagged. He felt like he was teetering on the edge of something, a cliff he hadn't seen coming. Are you with him? Is that what this is? Deborah sighed, as if explaining something to a child. Yes, Walter, I'm with him. And before you start with the dramatics, let me just say this. It's not about you. Not entirely. Not about me? Walter choked out a bitter laugh. You're my wife. How is this not about me? She stood then, smoothing the front of her robe, her movements deliberate and unhurried. You want the truth? Fine. You've been holding me back for years. I have a career, Walter. A future. And you? You're content to sit in this house, tinkering with your outdated gadgets, pretending like the world hasn't passed you by. I can't live like that anymore. Her words hit him like a physical blow, each one sharper than the last. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the truth was he didn't know how. Because deep down, he'd always known she was outgrowing him. He just never thought she'd leave him behind. So that's it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You're just done? With us? Deborah's expression softened for a moment, but it wasn't kindness. It was pity. I'm sorry, Walter. I really am. But I can't keep pretending this is enough for me. I deserve more. The room felt too small suddenly, the walls closing in around him. Walter's eyes fell on their wedding photo on the dresser. The glass cracked from when he'd slammed it down in frustration weeks ago. He'd meant to fix it, but now it seemed symbolic, irreparable. Just like them. You're a burden to my future, Deborah added, her voice icy now, final. And I'm not going to let you hold me back anymore. Walter stared at her, his chest tight, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to scream, to break something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she was causing him. But instead, he just stood there, silent and hollow, as the weight of her words settled over him like a shroud. And in that moment, he realized something that made his stomach churn. She wasn't just leaving him. She was erasing him. The kitchen table was a battlefield of paper, bank statements, credit card bills, and receipts spread out like evidence in a crime scene. Walter sat there, his glasses perched low on his nose, staring at the numbers that didn't add up. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the stale residue of last night's now weighed down by the weight of his mother's betrayal. It wasn't fair. None of it was. Walter stood, the chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, staring out at the overcast sky. The clouds hung low, heavy with the promise of rain. He could feel the storm coming, not just outside, but inside him too. The anger, the hurt, the sense of helplessness. It was all swirling together, building into something he couldn't ignore. "What are you going to do?" Mark asked, his voice small. Walter turned, his expression hardening. "I'm going to stop her," he said. "She's not going to get away with this. Not with what she's done to us." Mark looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "What do you need me to do?" Walter walked back to the table, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "For now, just keep this quiet. Don't let her know you told me. I need time to figure out my next move." Mark nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Okay, whatever you need, Dad." Walter placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me, for being here." Mark managed a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Always." As Mark left, Walter sat back down at the table, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He stared at the bank statements, the numbers now etched into his mind. This wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even about Deborah's affair. This was about respect, about dignity, and Walter wasn't going to let her take that from him too. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. It was time to stop being the victim. It was time to fight back. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the old computer in Walter's study. It had been years since he'd dusted off the machine, its once familiar whirring now a strange echo of a past life. He sat in the dim glow of the monitor, his fingers moving methodically across the keyboard. The faint scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air, a relic of the hours he'd spent hunched over the desk, sifting through digital debris like an archaeologist uncovering ruins. Deborah was out again. "Some late-night session at the studio," she'd said. Walter didn't bother asking for details anymore. He'd stopped believing her excuses weeks ago. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, piecing together the fragments of her betrayal. It wasn't just the emotional wounds that cut deepest. It was the financial ones. Their joint accounts, once a symbol of shared trust, now felt like a minefield. He'd started noticing discrepancies months ago, withdrawals he hadn't made, charges to boutique hotels, and payments to a recording studio he'd never heard of. At first, he chalked it up to Deborah's career, her relentless pursuit of the next big project. But the numbers didn't add up. Not even close. Walter's jaw tightened as he pulled up a folder labeled Studio Expenses. The files were a mess. Invoices, receipts, and contracts scattered haphazardly. His eyes zeroed in on a series of payments to a young musician named Ethan Cole. The name burned in his mind like a brand. Ethan, the kid with the too-perfect smile and the guitar slung low on his hip. The one Deborah had been spending so much time with. He clicked open a PDF invoice. $20,000 for production services. Walter scoffed. He knew what that meant. He'd spent decades in electronics, decoding systems and untangling wires. This was no different. He just had to follow the trail. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up bank statements and cross-referencing dates. The more he dug, the clearer the picture became. Deborah wasn't just funding Ethan's album. She was bankrolling his entire lifestyle. Luxury car payments, designer clothes, even a penthouse apartment downtown. All of it siphoned from their shared accounts. Walter's hands trembled as he copied the files onto a USB drive. The small device felt heavy in his palm, a tangible piece of evidence in a sea of lies. He stared at it for a long moment, his reflection distorted in its metallic surface. This wasn't just about the money. It was about respect, about reclaiming the life Deborah had so carelessly dismantled. The storm inside him raged, a tempest of anger and betrayal that threatened to consume him. But outwardly he remained calm. He had to. This wasn't the time for outbursts or reckless decisions. This was a calculated move, a chess game where every piece mattered. He leaned back in his chair, the old leather creaking beneath him. The room was silent now, the computer's hum fading into the background. Walter closed his eyes, letting the weight of it all settle over him. He thought of the years they'd spent together, the promises they'd made. It all felt like a distant memory now, a fading photograph left out in the rain. But he wasn't done yet, not even close. With a deep breath, Walter opened his eyes and reached for the phone. It was time to call Mark. His son had always been sharper than most, a natural when it came to numbers and patterns. Together, they'd unravel this mess. Together, they'd make sure Deborah paid for what she'd done. As the dial tone buzzed in his ear, Walter glanced at the USB drive sitting on the desk. It was more than just a collection of files. It was a weapon, and he was ready to use it. The air in Walter's study smelled faintly of dust and old solder, a metallic tang that clung to the corners of the room. His ancient computer hummed softly, the screen casting a pale blue glow across his weathered face. He'd been working for hours, his fingers stiff from typing, his eyes burning as they scanned lines of code and file directories. The USB drive Mark had given him was a Pandora's box, stuffed with financial records, emails, and, most damning of all, a folder labeled Audio User Backups. Walter clicked on it, his throat tightening as the list of files populated the screen. Dates, times, and cryptic names like studio_1_conversation filled the window. His hand hovered over the mouse, hesitating. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what was in those files. But he'd come this far. He double-clicked. The first recording crackled to life, and Deborah's voice filled the room, sharp and impatient. "You're pushing too hard," she was saying. "If anyone finds out, it's over. For both of us." There was a pause, and then a younger man's voice, smooth and calculating. "Relax, Deborah. You worry too much. As long as we keep him in the dark, we're golden." Walter's jaw clenched. He knew that voice. It belonged to the kid, no, the man Deborah had been spending so much time with. The one who'd been whispering sweet nothings in her ear while Walter sat at home, oblivious. He listened as the conversation continued, the words painting a picture he didn't want to see. The kid wasn't just after Deborah. He was after her money, her connections, her entire career. And he wasn't playing fair. Walter's eyes flicked to the corner of the screen, where a small icon indicated another file. This one was labeled deleted_recovery. His stomach churned as he opened it. The first clip was silent for a moment, then a faint rustling noise, followed by the unmistakable sound of Deborah's voice. Soft, vulnerable, almost pleading. "Please don't do this. I've given you everything. You can't just..." The kid cut her off, his tone icy. "You think I'm going to let you walk away? After everything? I've got enough on you to ruin you, Deborah. Don't test me." Walter's hands trembled as he paused the recording. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He'd spent weeks simmering in anger, plotting his revenge, imagining how good it would feel to see Deborah and her boy toy burn. But now he wasn't so sure. The woman in those recordings wasn't the cold, calculating Deborah who'd humiliated him at the party. She sounded scared, trapped. And the kid, he wasn't just a lover. He was a predator. Walter closed his eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He hated Deborah for what she'd done, for the way she'd made him feel small and worthless. But hearing her voice like that, hearing the fear in her words, it stirred something in him, something he didn't want to acknowledge. Pity, understanding, a flicker of the love he'd once felt for her. He opened his eyes and stared at the screen, his reflection blurry in the glass. He could still ruin them both. It would be easy. A few clicks, a couple of emails, and their little empire would come crashing down. But what would that make him? Just another player in their twisted game? Walter exhaled slowly, running a hand through his thinning hair. He wasn't sure what he was going to do. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival for all of them. And maybe, just maybe, it was about finding a way to rise above the mess they'd all created. The studio was dimly lit, the kind of place where shadows clung to corners and secrets felt at home. Walter stood in the control room, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the soundboard. The faint hum of machinery filled the air, a low, persistent buzz that seemed to echo the tension coiled in his chest. On the other side of the glass, the young musician, him, was fiddling with a guitar, oblivious to the storm about to break. Walter had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times. But now that it was here, his mouth felt dry, his hands steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. He pressed a button on the control panel, and the room was suddenly filled with the sound of Deborah's voice, low and intimate, followed by the young man's smug laughter. The playback was crisp, undeniable. Walter watched as the kid froze, his head snapping up like a deer caught in headlights. "What the hell is this?" the kid demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he stepped toward the glass. His face was pale now, the cocky veneer slipping as the recording continued to spill his secrets. Walter leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "That," he said, "is you digging your own grave. You think you're clever, don't you? Recording her, playing her. But you forgot one thing. I've been dealing with people like you my whole career. I know how to spot a rat." The kid's eyes darted to the door, but Walter had already locked it. He wasn't leaving until this was finished. "You've got two choices," Walter continued, his tone measured but unyielding. "You walk away from Deborah. You leave her alone, you leave our money alone, and you disappear. Or I take this recording and the others I've got straight to the press. How do you think your little indie career will hold up when the world finds out you're a blackmailing parasite?" The kid's bravado was crumbling fast. He stammered something about it being a misunderstanding, but Walter cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Save it. I'm not interested in your excuses. You've got 24 hours to get out of town. If I hear your name again, if I so much as see you within 100 miles of Deborah, I'll ruin you. And trust me, kid, I've got the tools to do it." For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of the recording. Then the kid nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Walter unlocked the door and stepped aside, his expression unreadable. As the kid slunk out, Walter couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. This wasn't just about Deborah anymore. This was about reclaiming his dignity, his control. And for the first time in months, he felt like he was winning. The room smelled faintly of her perfume, that expensive French stuff she'd always insisted on buying. It clung to the walls, to the furniture, to the air itself, like a ghost that refused to leave. Deborah stood in the doorway, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks, her arms crossed as if trying to hold herself together. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of everything had finally pressed her into something fragile. "Walter," she said, her voice cracking, "please, don't do this." I didn't stop packing. My hands moved methodically, folding shirts, stacking books, placing them neatly into the open suitcase on the bed. The sound of her crying was like static in the background, a noise I'd learned to tune out over the years. But this time, it wasn't just the usual manipulation. This time, there was something raw in it, something real. She was scared, and for the first time in our marriage, I didn't care. "You can't just leave," she said, stepping closer. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, a sound that used to make my heart skip. Now it just grated. "We can fix this. I made a mistake, but a mistake." I cut her off, my voice low but sharp. I didn't even look up. "You didn't trip and fall into his bed, Deborah. You didn't accidentally drain our accounts to fund his little music career. You didn't accidentally humiliate me in front of everyone we know. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. A whole damn series of them." Her breath hitched, and she reached out, her fingers brushing my arm. I flinched, pulling away. The touch felt like fire, like something that could burn me if I let it linger too long. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I was so wrong. But he lied to me too. He used me, Walter. He was recording me, trying to blackmail me. I didn't know what to do." I finally turned to face her, my hands still gripping the edge of the suitcase. Her face was a mess, streaked with tears and regret, but I couldn't find it in me to feel sorry for her. "Not anymore." "You didn't know what to do?" I repeated, my voice steady but cold. "You could have come to me. You could have told me the truth. But you didn't. You chose him. You chose to lie, to cheat, to steal. And now you want forgiveness because you got played? That's not how this works." She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand, silencing her. "No," I said firmly. "I'm done. I'm done being the guy you come back to when your little fantasies fall apart. I'm done cleaning up your messes. I'm done pretending this marriage was ever anything but a one-way street." Her shoulders slumped, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands clutching at the fabric of her skirt. The unsigned divorce papers sat on the nightstand, a stark reminder of the chasm between us. She glanced at them, then back at me, her eyes pleading. "Don't do this," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve you, but I love you, Walter. I always have." I laughed then, a bitter, hollow sound that surprised even me. "No, you don't," I said, zipping up the suitcase with a finality that felt like a weight lifting off my chest. "You love what I gave you, the stability, the money, the safety net. But you don't love me. You never did." She didn't argue. She just sat there, her face buried in her hands, as I picked up the suitcase and walked out of the bedroom. The sound of her sobbing followed me down the hall, but I didn't look back. Couldn't. In the living room, I paused, taking in the space that had been my home for so long. The furniture, the art, the carefully curated decor. It all felt foreign now, like a stage set for a play I hadn't realized I was acting in. I grabbed my keys from the hook by the door and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. For the first time in years, I felt free. Not happy, not yet, but free. And that was enough. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back. Not to her, not to the lies, not to the life that had slowly suffocated me. I had my tools, my skills, and my self-respect. And for now, that was all I needed. The engine roared to life as I pulled out of the driveway, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror. Somewhere behind me, Deborah was still crying, still begging, still clinging to the wreckage of what we'd built. But I didn't look back. This time I was moving forward. The workshop smelled like sawdust and lemon oil, a scent that always grounded Walter. He ran his fingers along the neck of the vintage Fender Telecaster, feeling the grooves in the wood where decades of hands had left their mark. The guitar had been a mess when he found it, scratched, warped, missing a tuning peg. But now, under the warm glow of the shop light, it was coming back to life, just like him. It had been 6 months since the divorce was finalized. 6 months since he'd watched Deborah sign the papers with shaky hands, her once sharp edges softened by regret. She tried to apologize, of course. Tried to explain how she'd been lost and confused, how the young musician had manipulated her. But Walter had just nodded, his jaw tight, and slid the papers back to her. He'd learned the hard way that apologies, like old guitars, could be polished to a shine but still ring hollow. The memory of that final confrontation still lingered, though. He could hear her voice, brittle and pleading, as she stood in the doorway of his house. "Walter, please. I made a mistake. Don't throw away everything we had." He'd wanted to scream at her, to remind her that she was the one who'd thrown it all away. But instead, he'd just closed the door, the click of the latch louder than any words could have been. Now, as he adjusted the truss rod on the Telecaster, he felt a strange sense of peace. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it didn't control him anymore. It was just another tool in his workshop, something he could pick up or put down as needed. The guitar was almost done. He'd replaced the worn-out pickups, rewired the electronics, and polished the body until it gleamed. All that was left was to string it up and tune it. He reached for a pack of new strings, the packaging crinkling in his hands. As he threaded the first string through the bridge, he thought about how much he'd learned, not just about fixing guitars but about fixing himself. He'd spent so many years trying to be what Deborah wanted, molding himself to fit her ambitions. But now, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the smell of fresh lacquer, he felt like himself again. Not the man she tried to shrink into a corner, but the man he'd always been. Steady, capable, worth more than she'd ever given him credit for. When the last string was in place, he picked up the guitar and strummed a chord. The sound was bright and clear, cutting through the quiet of the workshop. He smiled, a real smile, for the first time in what felt like forever. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the driveway. He could hear the faint hum of cicadas, the sound of summer winding down. For a moment he thought about calling Mark, maybe inviting him over to try out the guitar. But then he decided against it. This moment was his, and his alone. He played a few more chords, letting the music fill the room. It wasn't perfect. There were still a few rough spots, a few notes that didn't quite ring true. But that was okay. Perfection wasn't the point. The point was the work, the effort, the slow, steady process of making something broken whole again. And for the first time in a long time, Walter felt whole too.